Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for staying. We are from Claremont Graduate University, which is the first all-graduate research institution. It's located in Claremont, California. We flew in last evening from LA, and it's been great. We enjoyed hearing all the diversity of thought and all of the conferences and presentations that took place earlier today. We also represent the Graduate Student Council, which is the governing student body for our students. During this presentation, you will hear a lot of different perspectives on issues impacting the Middle East. And at Claremont Graduate University, we have a transdisciplinary approach to education. And along those lines, a lot of our presentation is going to focus on transdisciplinary. So you'll hear things about geography, history, policy, and culture. Okay, so we do look forward to hearing your questions, input, and connecting with any and all of you afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Whitney. I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thanks for the Middle East Conference and the dialogue for allowing us to come. My name is Amin Nash. I'm a master's student in English. My focus is on critical and literary theory. So I'm going to take a little perspective that's a little different than what we're used to about policy, but I'm still going to engage it with how the Arab and American image is perceived, how the allegories are developed, and how we kind of turn to metaphors. I'm directly associating this with certain images that appeared during contemporary times. So my specific topic is called Engaging When New Societies, Proper Policies Need Proper Knowledge. As I said, a critical lens will be used to analyze and theorize a possible approach examining the Arab and Muslim image in America. Our main target will be imagined and assumed archetypes and allegories. This is the kind of idea or the static imagery that's appearing through various American literature. And the overall purpose that we have is to discuss the need to increase academic knowledge. I think one thing that's missing is kind of a pedagogical approach to it, which is engaging people that know the subject or engaging people that are of the subject to let their voice be heard. Specific cases we'll be looking at, Mark Twain, Innocents Abroad. Mark Twain, if you don't know, he's an American humorist. F. Scott Fitzgerald, we'll be looking at The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is considered one of the greatest American novels. I'll also be using representations from the movie The Sheik, filmed in 1920, and Evelyn El-Sultani's analysis of the film or the TV show The Practice, which is a law firm TV show. We'll be engaging with critical analysis from Edward Said's Orientalism. I'm not going to focus on the concept of Orientalism. I'm focusing on how he developed the philological approach, which is the image of the Orient. And I'll also be looking at race and Arab Americans before and after 9/11, from invisible citizens to invisible subjects, edited by Amani Jamal and Nadine Aber. 3 essays I'll be focusing on will be by Louise Kankar of Marquette, Michelle Hartman of McGill, and Evelyn El-Sultani again from USC. And then we'll be looking at contemporary examples. All right, so let's jump into this. First one is Mark Twain. Specifically focusing on the narration by Mark Twain. Innocents Abroad was published in 1869 and was his best-selling book in his lifetime. So not if his whole life or his whole literary life, it's his lifetime. Specifically, the book is the characters respond to an advertisement to travel to Europe, North America, or North Africa, Middle East, Russia, and they have this advertisement. They're believing they're going to get this grand experience where they're going to see the Holy Land, where they're going to visit the locations where, it's portrayed to be beautiful. The time Mark Twain himself, this is not working. The Mark Twain himself, he had these sort of images and expectations that he wanted to receive, but the way Twain narrates it, and this is really important, is that Twain narrates it through humor. Humor is a tool to find the absurdities in little things that includes governments you're not even from, or societies you're not even from. This is what Twain's known for. So the specific narrative Twain uses is not really Twain himself, but it's a version of Twain. You could consider it like a gonzo version of Twain, where it's a guy who went to the Middle East and he's describing from his own vision. So this specific quote that I choose, do I need this? Oh, it's it's gonna be bothering me. Okay, so once they actually, throughout the book, Twain, he pokes fun at the French. He speaks French to different people from his American view, and he makes fun of their French compared to his American French, saying they don't know French. You know, there's little things like that. So this little thing, the moment he gets to Turkey specifically, he says mosques are plenty, churches are plenty, graveyards are plenty, but morals and whiskey are scarce. The Quran does not permit Mohammedans to drink. Their natural instincts do not permit them to be moral. They say the Sultan has 800 wives. This almost amounts to bigamy. It makes our cheek burn with shame to see such a thing permitted here in Turkey. But of course, it wouldn't be Twain if there wasn't some humor in it. We do not mind it so much in Salt Lake. So in Turkey, Twain, what he realizes begin that his imaginations and things that he expects are not of his own image. What he says is, when I think of how I've been swindled by the Book of Oriental Travel, I want a tourist for breakfast. So these imaginary appearances are direct, you know, you could say Twain has in some ways kind of I guess, a logical relationship with Edward Said in some ways. What Said says is what matters in his disguise is what I have been calling the Orientalist vision, a vision by no means confined to the professional scholar, but rather the common possession of all who have thought about the Orient and the West. So what Twain is realizing is that there's different studies, different images, different art that he's been reading that was not lived up to his expectation when he actually went to the Orient. So things that he was engaged with inside the US was not the truth, essentially. And this comes back to Edward Said's point. So it's not so much about the Orientalism concept of how it's developed, it's more about the image that's portrayed once somebody goes there. So there's imaginary, or this development of imaginary essentially causes for the person, whoever's writing the works, to fill in the gaps themselves. How do they imagine people lives like over there from here? They have to fill in the gaps themselves. So Twain, when somebody's reading some The Innocents Abroad originally, they might assume that Twain is actually talking bad about Arabs, that he's putting them down. There's one specific quote I choose. He says, when you ride through one of these villages, you meet a melancholy dog, a young boy without any clothes on. A Syrian village is the sorriest sight in the world. He goes on to say, I never liked the Chinaman as I do these degraded Turks and Arabs. But then he has kind of a sympathetic view of them, where he says, if I were to go to Damascus again, I would camp on Muhammad's hill for about a week and then go away. The Prophet was wise without knowing it when he decided not to go down into the paradise of Damascus. What we're seeing here is that there's an image developed once he's actually there. So somebody who might be studying this specific paragraph might see that Twain is actually talking bad about other people, that he's actually talking bad about the Arabs. But in truth, there's something that he learned from the situation that made him describe them as this situation, or in this position. If it never, this came before that specific line. If an ever oppressed place existed, it is this one we see fettered around us under the inhuman tyranny of the Ottoman Empire. These people are naturally good-hearted and intelligent, and with education and liberty, would be a happy and contented race. The Sultan has been lavishing money like water in England and Paris, but his subjects are suffering for now. This is Twain's humor, being able to pull out the satire, satirize the actual government itself. Once he's satirizing the actual government itself, there's a churn, an event that leads to the people themselves becoming representations of this tyranny. So once we read this again, when you ride through one of these villages, you first meet a melancholy dog, a young boy without any clothes on. A Syrian village is the starry sight. I wish the public to know about how this is located. He's describing the Ottoman Empire, of how the people are affected within this narration of tyranny. The point of this is that Twain essentially wished he knew better before going into before going to another country. People wish they would know a little bit more about another another character or another identity before they were to engage with that specific society. Louis Kenkar in this book, 9/11, or Race of Arab Americans Before 9/11, says the most noted feature of Arab exclusion in the United States are tactical. This exclusion has also been evident in political mobilization and in multicultural pedagogy. In pedagogy, Arabs have been excluded from race and ethnic studies, and when mentioned, often treated differently than other groups. As I said, what Twain's narrator ultimately realized is not so much that his images are being met. It's more that he's satirizing, realizing the tyranny under the Ottoman Empire that's making the people live in this situation inside the Holy Land. going on to Edward Said, when there's no pedagogical give back, when there's nobody to say, look, what you're representing is not instantly correct, or what you're trying to write about, or your imagery is not correct to source, there's going to be something called a static imagery, to which Edward Said describes. There, he goes on. This is the philologically is from anything that's written. There's nothing that, according to Edward Said, there's nothing that's been challenged from literature that represents the pedagogical challenge. Edward Said goes on to say that there's the Arabs are presented in an imagery of static. That means they don't change. They are in a constant conceptual process of never really breaking through this imagery of whatever's been represented before. So when we look onto other, to view this static imagery and look onto other novels, we could see this in The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald uses the narrator of Nick Carraway, who is essentially an observer of the American life. Partying, jazz, drinking, the good stuff. If you read it from a perspective of a minority culture, specifically through the one where jazz actually brings life to the audience, if you read it as if, you see he's describing the people in the slums living a life, and the Greek man is allowed to cry with the black man, you can see there's a different kind of life that Nick Carraway is describing. One of the most incidents that I noticed was when Jordan Baker convinces Nick Carraway to go to convince Gatsby to use his house, or convince Nick Carraway to use his house to appease Daisy. Then this song comes on from a bunch of kids in the city where it says, I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep. This song comes right when Jordan Baker asked Nick Carraway to use Gatsby, to use his house to swoon Daisy for Gatsby. This song is a famous song from the 1920s that derived from this movie, which was the 1921 film starring Rudolph Valentino, an Italian immigrant who became a sexual icon. His image and his overall flamboyance, the way he was acting, he flexed his nostrils, he grabbed the girl, he overwhelmed everybody. This image became an allegory of what Arab men are expected to be, which is hostile, or oppressive over women. Women are supposed to be submissive. The fact that this song came on the time that Daisy or Jordan Baker asked Nick Carraway to use his house for Daisy, it means that Jay Gatsby is adopting this specific mask of the Arab man to win Daisy. Remember, Jay Gatsby is a con man who has to wear a different mask to win his way from being poor to being what he perceives as rich. The one he finds most success is through Rudolph Valentino's Sheik. Ultimately, Jay Gatsby, as you see, he's killed by a poor man, which is the one thing he was trying to get away from. But the point is that Arab and Muslim people are used as allegorical allegories, which means that their representations can be adopted into literature or into different various spaces that allows them that essentially represents them to be allowed to have predatory actions over the other characters. And that's from the adoption of an Arab man. To go on to more criticism, when it comes to more modern or contemporary times, the idea of being Arab or having an Arabness inside America is challenged, specifically after World War II and into the current war times. Being an Arab and trying to adopt your identity, which is speaking your language, spreading your culture, your music, the perception is that it cannot mix with American culture, which is Western individuality, things like that. From Michelle Hartman and Miguel, she's a PhD for literature. Though Arabness is meant to be an open and all-embracing category, it is concentrated to Americanness, which is defined as opposition to Arabs. By allowing for a slippage between the Arabic language, the mainstream Arab literary tradition, Arab concerns, and the Arab spirit, all in contrast to Americanness, a problematic logic based in the essentialist notions to show through. Going on to Edward Said as well, who agrees with this point. One of the most important parts is this last part. One of the striking aspects of the new American social science attention to audience is a singular avoidance of literature. Edward Said is pointing out that after World War II and into war times, the image or the exact allegories that were represented before from Twain and Gatsby and other writers those allegories are being adapted into administrative needs and policy needs. So this theory can be visualized during the war on terror, specifically when you're trying to define the metaphor of terror. Who is the metaphor of terror? This is when Evelyn al-Satani comes in, specifically Evelyn al-Satani, once again, she's a USC professor. She specifically looks at this TV show, The Practice, which takes realistic situations that happen within post-war times, or not post-war, post 9/11 times, and adapts them into TV form. So this specific episode she uses is from Bad to Worse, which was aired on December 1st, 2002. We can start from here. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. This is from a lawyer arguing with an airline CEO who refuses to allow specific people to go into his airline. His reason is that it's his business, so he can choose the right of safety over the right of political correctness, which is not allowing specific groups of people to come in. Evelyn Satani observes this as racism is reduced to political correctness, and political correctness is reduced to use as pleasant etiquette. Here's where we see the construction of discourse of exceptionalism. Racism is wrong except in certain times and only during exceptional times of crisis. In this specific case of what we just saw before about the lawyers, the audience, what Soltani is pointing out is that the audience is questioning the legitimacy of the authority, which is the lawyers and the government CEO, as well as having sympathy for the Arabs and Muslims. The problem is that the institution and authority becomes a question at the expense of the Arab and Muslim person. Because the Muslim person are in this position where they are represented, or they are in the need of you can say being in a downplay position where they have to kind of defend their own self. It's in the context of being within this oppressive context, you can say. So what she says is that a device that is used to gain audience identification is usually associated with good, as opposed to an evil one is a tool that the media uses in order to gain affection from the audience. But sometimes this downplays or it backfires onto themselves, because the image of the Arabs and the image of the Muslims is essentially, if you need them to be a functional character inside a story, or even a functional character inside media, you need them to work within the context of terrorism and of the context of violence. And this is what Evelyn Soltani is observing as the current method of media representation of Arabs and Muslims. So I'm going to go on to a positive future, just to conclude everything, because I have to go on to them. Rami Malek, we see that he's the first the man of Arab heritage to win the Best Oscar Award. The reason why I use Rami Malek is because he didn't win the award because he was representing an Arab Muslim man, or he was doing something different outside of acting as an Arab Muslim man. He won it because of playing Freddie Mercury in Bohemian Rhapsody. He's standing up here holding the Oscar as Rami Malek, not as Rami Malek the Arab. So there's other dozens, there's the Hadids, there's other people that are in American scholarship of American media that are able to portray themselves. They're able to portray their actions as part of their heritage, but also as part of being an Arab American or a Muslim American within the Muslim American heritage. Arab Egyptian couple. Did I say he was Muslim?
He's not Muslim.
Did I say he was Muslim, or?
No, you didn't, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, he's not Muslim. Okay, yeah, he's Arab Egyptian Coptic,
Yes.
but it's important to know that he's not Muslim. Yeah, thank you. So to conclude, as more studies for Arab Americans and Muslim Americans emerge, it kind of goes back to Edward Said's point or other points. There needs to be pedagogical engagement to know who the people are that we are specifically studying, and to know who the specific environment is that we're trying to engage in before we start coming up with different rules and different policies. For the case of Arab and Muslim Americans, there's a one-sided idea of who they were. Instead of characterizing individuals to the point of dehumanizations, it would be advantageous to see how they've integrated and engaged with the community, instead of taking the idea from previous times and using that Instead, let's look at integrated, how they develop businesses, or how they develop different rules, and see how that has contributed to the country. So unfortunately, there's also the shadow political social context, but the last point is to pay attention to Fulbright scholars and those participating in various Middle East exchange programs, various people going over there and coming back. These people are really worth to hear their stories, worth to hear their studies, and worth to see what they're talking about, to engage with them. And that's it. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. So, in the program, I'm sure you all had time to read the abstract, which I read over, and I'm like, pretty compelling and some strong language there. So, yes, I saw someone nod their head. Yes, there was. So, the name of our presentation, my name is Whitney F. Martinez, by the way. And the name of our presentation is The Clash of Civilizations, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Balfour Declaration, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, looking forward with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 16. And we'll go into each of those because there are many moving parts to this presentation. So we're going to try and break it down as much as we can. So a little bit about us first. This was actually at Drucker Day about 2 weeks ago. We're part of the Peter F. Drucker Ito School of Business, and we had Drucker Day, and this is Mr. Ryan Patel. You may recognize him from CNN. And I'm doing my PhD in political science. I recently just passed my qualifying exam. I'm originally from New York, so I'm happy to be back on the East Coast because I've been in LA for the past 5 years just trying to pursue the dream. I am the president of the Graduate Student Council, and I'm also a singer and songwriter. So I research and travel, and to date, I've been to over 15 countries doing this. So this is very exciting for me, and I'm happy to be here. We are students of Ambassador Salama Shaker, who actually referred us to this conference. We're all actually in one of her classes, which is called Global Power Rivalry and Comparative Politics, specifically in the Middle Eastern context. Well, you have to introduce yourself, and we have like the important fact, the fun fact.
Oh yeah, I'm from Rashed, California. I mean, no one knows what that is. It's Northern California, in the Central Valley, agricultural town, a couple hours from San Francisco. That's like the one city that a lot of people know about. And I was an athlete. I swam in Division I in Illinois for a little bit, and then I transferred to the University of Laverne, which is not too far from Claremont. And I work at the as the chief of staff at the Graduate Student Council, along with my colleague here.
So I like to know what I'm getting into when I get into things, so I thought we'd give you all a presentation outline. We are going to dive into the historical context, which my colleague Amir Rashed is going to be covering, and then we're actually going to define the clashes before we actually speak about the clashes that we're going to address. And then we'll go into the case of Israel-Palestine and kind of briefly speak about some of those solutions we've seen over the years, over the decades. And then the policy context is going to be the connector here. That's what we're going to be connecting, the bridge. And then the road ahead, and really trying to get to how history and historical context can help us in developing policies that are culturally competent. That variable that seems to be left out of a lot of the different narratives and proposed solutions moving forward.
One thing to understand about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, along with the Balfour Declaration, is understanding the historical aspects of, even before these documents were ever a thought in the minds of the individuals that created these agreements. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a post-World War I agreement by the British and French diplomats, Mark Sykes and Francois Georges Picot, respectively. And it was up to them, essentially, to draw out the map, the borders, to declare the sovereignty of specific countries for the interests of their own, leaving out Turkey, leaving out the indigenous people in all the lands that they conquered as their protectorates, as their mandates. Along 2 years after that, which was in 1916, so a couple years after, in 1919, I believe, the Balfour Declaration was enacted. It's created by or proposed by the Russian chemist Chaim Weizmann, who went to Lord Rothschild's in England, as he was ruling at England at the time, to propose the land of Palestine for the state of the Jewish people. And so on. The Middle East is affected by those two agreements to this day. The argument that some scholars have been proposing or been arguing about or just been discussing is Iran, or it's recreating the Persian Empire, reuniting the region as these Western imperialists were dividing the region. Is Iran uniting it? Well, we have thousands of years of history to look at. We're talking about complex people with complex histories. So I want to start off with Ibn Khaldun. He is a 14th century historiographer and historian who wrote about the start of the civilizations that emerged out of the rivers. We have the Huanghe River in China, the Indus River in India, the famous Nile in Egypt. But more specifically, we're going to look at the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and the origins of Sumer, Babylon, and all these empires and all these nomads that came in, conquered, assimilated themselves as the dominant world power, their own known world power, if you will. So his pattern was conquest, consolidation, expansion, degeneration, and conquest. So nomads would conquer, consolidate, or take anyone who's captive, or the cities, make it their own. Expansion along with it. Degeneration, they become soft city folks, and then they get conquered by some other tribes or nomads. So for the first, we have the diaspora of the three children of Noah from post-Diluvian period. So Shem, scholars would say, originated or settled himself and had descendants along the Arabian Peninsula and even towards where Iraq and Iran would be in modern times. Ham in Africa, and then Japheth somewhere in Turkey and Southeast Asia, and even towards the Central Asians. So highlighting this area, the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. Ashur, for those who don't know, is a descendant of Shem, started the Assyrian kingdom, or the Assyrian people. As if you would talk to any modern-day Assyrian, they would say, we come from Ashur. Elam, Iran, same thing. So we start with Mesopotamia. It started off actually not from the Babylonians or any, but the Sumers, at least talked about people who had a link of systems and combined it into one single entity and called it Sumer. And they, were known for their mathematics. They were known for their astronomy. They were known for their physics. They were known for even some of the earliest languages. Well, the Akkadians came in as part of the pattern that Ibn Khaldun wrote about, conquered Sumer, and Sargon of Akkad quoted, "Now any king who wants to call himself my equal wherever I go, let him go." Basically, he said, show me anyone who's conquered this much territory as I have. His empire was no bigger than modern-day Serbia. Well, later, the Akkadians were conquered by another nomadic tribe. Newcomers will come in, assimilate themselves, become soft city folks, and get conquered again. So we have the Assyrian Empire, which was the well-known, have a lot of historical reference even to this day. And we can see that as I talk later on about it. It was the lingua franca of the Middle East. The Romans used it, the Greeks used it. Even arguably, as some scholars would say, even the Ottomans, the Turks would use it at some areas to communicate with the people for taxes, to collect taxes. And it has the origins of Syriac, Phoenician, Hebraic, and even Arabic, as there are a lot of similarities. About almost 50% have some Assyrian origins, Aramaic origins. So, who conquered the Assyrians? Well, the Persian Empire did. I questioned it as saying, why is it the Persian Empire? Well, you have the Babylonian Empire, you had the Assyrian Empire. How did they govern their empires? What was their approach to the people who they conquered? Did they leave them there? Did they take them away? Well, that's what they did. They took them away. Famously, the Assyrians came in, took the Israelites, the Northern Kingdom Israelites, and dispersed them. Placed them in Nineveh, placed them in what we know as Babylon in ancient times, or spread them across their known world. The Babylons did the same thing with the Southern Kingdom, Judah, Benjamin. Those are the two famous incidents that what they did, and any other tribes too that they conquered, and I can go back here, that they took it and placed them somewhere else. Well, Persia was not like that. They followed the opposite strategies of Babylon and Assyria. They were known for their political reforms, most notably multiculturalism. They didn't take the Israelites away from their towns or wherever they were from. In fact, King Cyrus, and the historical proof of that is the Cyrus scroll, set them back to Israel and allowed them to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. And that was part of their religion, Zoroastrianism, which is a more passive, which is a more, we let you do what you want as long as you pay taxes to the central government. So the people could live however they want, keep their culture, keep their religion, keep their language. It wasn't this uniformity of cultures and creating one big mesh of whatever the emperor of that empire wanted to call it. So another thing, the Persian Empire, as we'll see through other graphs, other charts, remained very strong in their heritage because they were successful in merging other empires, even when other empires around the area were taking control of land. So they have 3,000 years of information, of libraries, more than what Europe has 12,000 years ago. Well, here's the empires that changed the Middle East, and it goes back to when I said of the uniformity of cultures into one. Everybody was called Greek during the Alexandrian Empire. Everybody was called Greek during the Roman Empire. So you have, the Persian Empire really never fell, but only because of Alexander the Great came in and started, through wildfire, coming and taking over the Persian Empire. The Romans pretty much just piggybacked off of the Greek Empire. That's why the full name is Greco-Roman Empire. So all this to say is that we're having now a border change. We're having culture change, amalgamations. And we're having, through history, a formation of a group of people who are going to be called themselves one thing but mean another. And I'll explain to that later. So when the Roman Empire fell, it was divided in two. The east or the west half fell, right? And then the east side remained very strong because it had more resources, because all the money went to the east side. So it became the same. So it remained intact. Scholars, however, didn't know what to name it because it was very hard to differentiate who was Greek and who was Roman. So they called it Byzantine Empire. Well, towards the east more, the Parthians came in and started forming their own empire. They were a group of nomads from north of the Iranian mountains and came down and formed Parthia. And they were always in war with the Persian Empire. The Byzantine Empire, sorry. And we can see that here. The Sassanid Empire came later on and conquered, part of the same pattern as Ibn Khaldun mentioned. So as they were all fighting, they seemed to be missing or not caring to notice something brewing in the Arabian Peninsula that blew up and expanded. And we have the very mighty Islamic Empire. So now you have religion in play. You have Islam, Arabization. You have the strength of the Arabian culture now implemented all throughout the North Africa and even towards India. So essentially you have the amalgamations, millennia of culture mixing, millennia of people mixing, race mixing. Arab does mean mixed. And you have now different people with different territories, different politics, and different ideologies. So what has been uniting the people? Is it war? Is it a major catastrophe that might occur? Is it an alien invasion? What is it? And why has it been so different? And why can't we seem to agree with something? You have border issues, and identity is a very hot topic in the Middle East right now. Arab nationalism. And we have the Kurdish people wanting their own rights to the land. Palestine, the same issue right now. And then now you have, where about our lineage from Shem? That was before the Arabs came in. That was, we're not Arabs, we've just been Arabized. We have Arab names, Arabian religion, if you will. So through all these empires, through all this change, you are forming people today, a group of people today, a race of people. So now, if we fast forward, you have the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest empires, and it controlled for hundreds of years. And then it fell in World War I. And the winners were France and Britain. And that led to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Middle East. In the yellowish color, you have British territories, the bluish, French, and then Italian in the bottom. So why did they choose these lands? What do they know about these lands that could benefit their interests? Well, Britain chose Transjordan, which was a combination of Palestine and Jordan, and Baghdad, Iraq. And Syria had, French had Greater Syria, which was modern-day Lebanon and modern-day Syria. Well, we do know that Egypt was owned by the British at the time. They wanted to protect their interests. It's always been protecting their interests and not the interests of the Arabs who were living there at the time. Well, they owned the Suez Canal. They needed to connect to their strategic and important colony in India with this trade route. So if they owned this area which connects to the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal, their interests are safe. Their interests are secured. As for France, well, they've been sponsoring that area. They've been giving money for education, for infrastructure, for electricity. They wanted that because they were pumping money into that area. So, and then you had the borders that were formed. So, if you look closely on this map, which I might be on the next slide. Oh, sorry. So this is where you have the start of decentralization. You have this vague area which was promised by the British and the French, Kurdistan, which never was promised until later on. I think recently now there is an autonomous regime now, Kurdistan. You have this British-controlled area which is connected to the sea and where much of the oil is, as well as this yellow area was international, and that was to decide, because you have the Balfour Declaration coming in. That's going to be for the Jewish people. So, but you have these influences, the Western influence, the Western culture. You have the access to oil, the creation of pipelines. You have Israel, the creation of Israel, and the divisions inside the borders and not outside the borders. It's not the hardware of the countries, it's the software. You have to understand, because of these borders that were in place, you're dividing people that want to be together and putting people together that don't want to be together. So here's the key figures to consider and the ethnic groups. Syria. Syria was formed, Palestine was left out, and Iraq was formed. You can also even put Lebanon in there too. These countries were formed, with the exception of Palestine, thanks to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. However, it left out the Kurds and the Assyrians that no one talks about. And they do have a say and have their rights to specific lands because of the empires, because of the Shemitic line, because of this nationalism that's rising, that's saying we're not part of the Arab, we're not part of the of Arabs, we do have ties because of history. And that's something that arguably, as said, diplomats probably don't understand with the maps, with the history that along with it. This is not hundreds of years of history. You have to consider thousands of years and millennia of history. So the division and the endurance of the Sykes-Picot. So you have pipelines from the bottom image, from Kirkuk, Iraq to Haifa, Israel, from Kirkuk, Iraq to Tripoli, Lebanon. So conveniently placed as these were part of the British Empire that it has strategic access to the Mediterranean Sea and out to Europe. And also, this was international territory. Jordan was part of Britain, and Iraq was part of Britain, and north here, where Kurdistan was supposed to be, was heavily sponsored by the British to secure a place for the pipelines to have to be safe. Closely here, this green is supposed to be the marsh. It's very marshy, that land is, and it really did terrible on the job of establishing a border, as it's only 50 miles to the sea, to the Persian Gulf, which more modernly frustrated Saddam Hussein, and one of the reasons why he wanted to annex Kuwait. And he even said these borders were established after he annexed Kuwait for a little bit of time, was created by Western imperialism. It wasn't Iraq and Kuwait were supposed to be uniform through empires. The Babylonian Empire is a big example. But it didn't happen that way. Kuwait was given its own borders. Iraq was given 50 miles or less of shore. This is a very Shia-dominated area, and the central government at the time was Sunni. And it's cost too much money to go into marshy lands and take out oil, whereas Kuwait is very dry and has abundance of oil, and Iraq gets no benefits because of the pipelines that you have to consider as well. So we do have now we have the Balfour Declaration, talk about that a little bit. Chaim Weizmann's proposal, and the Zionist plan for the Middle East for a greater Israel, which was taken from Genesis 15:8, from the Nile to Euphrates. That's how big Israel is supposed to be, or want it to be. And here's the source if you want to look at that some more. So this also reinforces the division. When Israel came, nothing but war. When Israel came, nothing but civil war. When Israel came, nothing but non-state actors coming in and wanting to create their own borders. So lastly, I want to end with this before my partner Whitney steps up and talks about her case study, is the dreams of old. This is a picture I found, and I think it's very adequate into what is currently going on and being seen. So what scholars have been saying, what people have been arguing, is that Iran is unifying. Why? Through proxy war, or through multiculturalism, or in the back still has Zoroastrianism as part of this, along with amalgamating to the Shia governance that it has. It has been supporting and sponsoring Iraq and even Afghanistan, even after the U.S. left. Iraq, very Sunni, Shia dominated, the governance in Syria is heavily reinforced by Iran now. So is Lebanon, so is Hamas, or Hezbollah, and Yemen too, which has now, which the Saudis are afraid because it has some Shia influence and Shia presence in a place, in a territory, in a peninsula that is supposed to be mostly Sunni. Not to mention the east side of the peninsula is Shia dominated, and they're trying to keep them intact because with the '79 revolution, they were afraid that all across North Africa and even to Indonesia, that Shias will rise up and take over, and become the anti-status quo turned status quo. And this is all based off or formed because of the Sykes-Picot, because of the division, because of Western influence, and Iran not being conquered by, not being literally conquered by Iran, the British or the French or any West, were influenced and did not want it to be that way. Through influence, just like, and through their policies, just like the ancient empire, multiculturalism, Zoroastrianism, letting the Arabs or letting people in their land be. It's shown, or some people can, some argue, that it's successful in Iran's point of view. And with that, I'll leave it to the partner.
Thank you very much for that. So we've had. He made it thunder. So this is. Give that man some water. So our presentations are connected, and I'm going to attempt to bridge it. So we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, arguably dividing up the Middle East. I know this was driving me a little nuts, this going crazy. I'm sorry about that. So I wonder if there's a way to stop the clicker but still be able to navigate. I may be able to do it from here. I'll set this down. So you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is arguably dividing up the Middle East, and the Balfour Declaration, where you have a group of people, Jewish people, being placed in territory that is currently being fought over. So the connection here is when you have those two historical documents laying the foundation, it's laying a foundation for something called the Clash of Civilizations. If you might recall, an author, scholar, Samuel Huntington, published a book called, in a 1996 book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. Now, this text was highly contested and is still debated. And I actually did a paper disproving Huntington's point about the borders in the Middle East being monolithic, but that's for a different presentation. So I like going back and forth here and there. But what he's saying is pretty outstanding. This is during a time when many analysts, politicians, researchers are arguing that what we're clashing over is economics, is politics. And here Huntington comes in and says, actually, what we're going to clash over is culture. That is going to be the main thing that divide the lines, not only in the Middle East, but worldwide. Right? And when you think about culture, culture is the bedrock of pretty much any civilization. It includes cuisine, religion, and arguably many of the cultures we see, culture influences their politics, their policies, Islamic banking. They're definitely influenced by their cultural identities and norms. And so just to break down a bit, in the book and then subsequent texts published after that kind of built on the argument, that's what us researchers do. Civilizations is defined as the process or stage by which a society or place reaches an advanced stage. So that's like a collective, right? Then you have identities, and that's going a little bit more micro. So what about the people who make up a civilization? Identities. And a little later, I'm going to use the analogy of an olive tree, symbolic of the people, the Palestinian people, to kind of give examples of this. So identities is the condition of being a certain person or thing, or the qualities, beliefs, personality, et cetera, et cetera. So that's more at an individual micro level. Then you have, sorry, I'm not done, sorry. Then you have power politics, power rivalry. Is that what we're clashing over? Is it our politics? Or is politics one of the tactics employed for people to fight, for nations to use to fight? So power politics and rivalry is described as a political action by a person or group which makes use or is intended to increase their power and influence. And we do see that in the chess game in the Middle East, and how different Western societies and civilizations have a hand in that as well. And then when we put all of these components together, we have the culture clash. And it's a collective. So culture is defined as the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or social group. And I like to define certain terms because there tends to be sometimes conflicting definitions of things. So these are the definitions that I'm using going into the rest of the presentation. So this slide is titled History, Culture, Stakeholders, and Policy. And my colleague here covered the historical part. This is a perspective dissertation proposal abstract, a snippet of an abstract that I have. And I'm going to read it for you all. The road to fruitful policy design includes in-depth research and the questioning of historical accounts as told through regional literature. Knowledge of cultural impacts on ways of life for civilizations, ways in which stakeholders considered culture and past policy development, convening of stakeholders and targets for open discussion about differences and similarities, an understanding of measures undergone to address the conflict and their returns, the stories behind the successes and failures of said policy, a roadmap built on this knowledge for the way forward, and the appropriate partner agencies and individuals suitable to help present probable policy proposals, outline target goals, and guide the way forward in a succinct and holistic manner. Now, in a perfect world, that would be the process, right? We don't just go in as policymakers and with our bounded rationality and conditioning and stereotypes and all the other things we have, kind of say, based on the limited information I have, this is the best policy for this region. We would actually do research, right? And so that's really the foundation of what I'm arguing here to connect what Mr. Rashed just spoke on. So collectively, Amin and Amir touched on a lot of the literature that I review in my perspective proposal to speak about the clash of civilizations. And so I go through Frumpkin's argument that speaks about the fall of the Ottoman Empire and how the different players and actors during that time, well, for lack of better words, did not consider the culture variable. Were more so about getting ahead. Their own interests were put first. And of course, we have Huntington. Said, of course, goes into Orientalism, and that's the questioning of literature, the narratives behind the literature, which is through Western lenses about the Orient, and how there are some implicit biases in those things because they're told at different points in time with perspectives from people who are not the people who are on the receiving end of those categorizations. And I'm questioning those things that we have, that we in our literature, that is fact. So questioning the so-called facts. Culture and imperialism. Said says, and this is also reiterated in Culture Matters, that even in a global economy, when you have third world developing countries wanting to be competitive, that their culture is going to largely remain their own. No matter how much they're trying to compete economically, their culture will largely remain their own. Henry Kissinger is great at portraying the point of, when we speak about a world order, what is the world order really? The way that the Middle East describes and defines their ideal world order, or the order they've been operating on since, is different from what it looks like to, say, New Zealand or the United States of America. And since it's a chess game and the subsequent outcomes are connected, there needs to be some type of streamlined, some type of approach, that a definition that is agreed upon by all parties, and we don't have that. And so he's speaking about the approach to getting to that point. 1 second, I think. The rest of these books are more so, we're academics, and I like to sometimes bringing different types of texts that tell stories from different lenses. And I appreciated the storytellers earlier today because it's a great way to bring in art and English into our respective fields. And so there are different books here that really capture the sentiments of people on the ground in Israel-Palestine and the issues that they're facing. And it kind of gives a different perspective from the historical narrative and more so of the individual micro level. In Palestine, am I a refugee? Am I a citizen? Am I not? Am I a visitor? What is my identity now? And so it gives us a different lens to the culture clash and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and actually one that isn't really told. Okay. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of all the different proposals and policies we've seen over time, but I do want to say that at the heart and the core of it, while politics, economics, religion, they all play a part in this conflict, at the heart of it, I argue, and many scholars have argued, that we're speaking about claims to land and inheritance. And so this is built on biblical, we have one group having inheritance, claiming to have inheritance to this land based on biblical context. And another group claiming to have claims to this land based on it being their indigenous land. So those are two very difficult things. And when we kind of step back from the scholarly lens of this, right, and we take a step back to the human and we strip ourselves down, that's, culture is very close and ingrained in this. And this is what makes it really difficult to at times tackle in the ways that we have. And so there's been one-state solutions, two-state solutions, alternatives to one-state solutions, alternatives to two-state solutions. And one of the main issues is that, well, if you have a one-state solution, then that's a humanitarian catastrophe, because that ultimately means that one identity it's the dissolution of a culture. And then if we have a two-state solution, well, how do we define the borders? Because we would have done that long before if it was just that clear cut and dry. And so those are there's so much more I can go into, but I'll leave it at that. And of course, in terms of impacts, you have the humanitarian lens with the rise of deaths on both sides, but arguably Palestinians being at the hands of a lot of deaths, and the economic impacts. And as well, the entire conflict kind of raises a point of there being a culture of resistance, in a way, on both sides. There's a culture of resistance, and conflict has become synonymous with the culture of people who are fighting over land that they believe that they inherited, or that they are their indigenous land. So in the case of the Palestinians, there is, I use this on my qualitative exam to again attempt at getting the artistic lens in there. So please let me know if this works. So what I did is I compared specifically Palestinians. I compared the clash of civilizations. You remember earlier I talked about identities, civilizations, power politics. So the olive tree is representative of Palestinians. So of Palestinians, and I'm sorry, this will be about Palestinians. The olive tree is symbolic of the entire conflict. You have the tree roots. The roots grow from the ground. They are the identities. They are the individual identities. So individual people. Then you have the tree trunk. That's the civilization, when we all come together. The collective identity. Who and what are we as a collective? And then you have the tree branches, right, which are the politics. Politics sway like tree branches. They come and go depending on where we are. Power rivalry, and of course that looks different depending on who's on the receiving end of certain politics. And then you have tree leaves. Tree leaves are even more unsteady than branches. They blow off sometimes. And I think tree leaves represent an array of situations over the years. Issues that grow from the sum of all parts. As more Palestinian ideologies are formed, there are different ways in which different situations that they're facing. The tree oozing during different seasons. These are the varying seasons of tactics used to fight for beliefs. So there are different media advertisements that have been used to combat oppression. So there are different tactics used to combat what's happening on the ground. And the tree of the whole, I argue, is the entire culture. It's all of these things that kind of make up culture. Not yet. Sorry, I tend to stop, and it's like, I just want the audience to really marinate the point, that's all. So here's another quote I have. I like quoting myself sometimes. The Palestinian conflict has all clashes. However, they can be linked, dissected, and researched to address through policy. And I'm going to flip to the policy side, which is my area of expertise. The clash of Palestinian identity, civilization, and power politics during different types of conflict throughout history is all-encompassing to its culture, from food, religion, to resilience. War and resistance has become part of Palestinian culture, whether inherent or formulated due to external experiences, which is what clashes with the culture and beliefs of the nation of Israel. I'm going to skip this one, but I can send the presentation so y'all can read that. So when we switch over to the policy side, the United Nations, there have been attempts. The United Nations has attempted to set out and outline policy goals to help to try and bring cohesion and connectivity and some type of agreement for the conflict, which have been unsuccessful. Sometimes different groups have superseded that and gone over the boundaries of what was actually outlined in the policy. I just want to read what's the goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. They address the global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate, prosperity, peace, and justice. So the two goals that stick out to me that could help in the way forward to addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are goal number 16 and goal number 17. So the first one is peace, justice, and strengthen institutions. So it seems as though there is lack of connectivity and cohesion within each of the nations themselves. So Palestinian leaders aren't necessarily united in their viewpoints. Some want to unite and kind of recognize the nation of Israel. Some want to continue to fight. Others aren't sure. And we all know that if there is a single movement and there are divisions and intersectionalities, then the entire collective whole is not a tall standing tree, right? So strengthened institutions would really start on a local level and build up from there. But it's important to have different stakeholders convene with those stakeholders at the United Nations to discuss their differences with each other. And of course, the United Nations development goals are not in any way binding, and sometimes often people argue that they don't have any teeth. However, what they do have is hope and a clear strategic plan for how the way forward may look if cooperation is possible. The second one is partnerships, and that's important because this conflict impacts not just each nation in the Middle East, but also many Western nations as well. It's just that there are many other pressing issues happening. It's the world. There's always something else going on, and depending on who you are and where you're sitting at in the world, there's something that is going to supersede this conflict. And with partnerships, what you do is you sit down and you outline your goals and your priorities. And it's all about rhetoric and narrative. And so the hope is that if there's an opportunity to convene and discuss how this conflict is directly impacting specifically economics, that's something that usually raises, okay, I'm listening. And then and hopefully culture can be that variable that raises that too, right? That's important. So I think partnerships is also a way forward. Okay, so to conclude, the role of history in modern day policy is crucial to understanding and guiding the way forward. Historical rhetoric and the mismanagement of the culture variable, which I think can be seen throughout all three of our presentations. So rhetoric is important, and specifically thinking about the messenger, the time frame, the context, all of those variables are important. And I think it's important that we go back and consider these things, consider the messenger instead of taking things at face value and saying this is something that's concrete and not questioning certain things. And that goes both ways, right? I'm sure what we're saying in this presentation is being questioned and challenged, and that's great, because that's what builds on the accumulation of knowledge. That's the point. Historical documents and policy implications. Policymakers, so political scientists have a term called bounded rationality. And what that means is, as a policymaker, I can't consider every single what's called a fact and statistic about any given group at any given time and say, this is all factual, and this is all the information I need to make a policy. Policymakers can't do that, but they still have to do their jobs and make policy. So most policies are made on snapshot decisions based on stereotypes about groups, which is what gets into the inequality in public policy part. If we consider historical documents, and again with the rhetoric and the questioning and the challenging of such, it can help with the public policy process. Historical foundations for development of holistic approaches to cross-cultural policy. Is anyone familiar with the term echo chambers? Yeah, so echo chambers is pretty much having the same status quo people in the room kind of say, so if I'm representative, let's say, for example, of the 1%, and I'm surrounded by 1%ers, and we're saying this is the best policy for this marginalized group. What do you all think? Yes, we agree. Let's all go home. So we're in a space where we already have confirmation bias, and then we're also surrounding ourselves with people who hold the same viewpoints as us, who has the same lived and shared experience as us, and we are not allowing into the room people who are actually on the receiving end of this policy. So in order to dispel echo chambers, we have to bring in something which Ben Habib in The Claims of Culture, one of the books I had on the literature review slide, she brings in this what is it called? Social constructivism, which is actually allowing for some type of process where the marginalized people come into different rooms and actually say what the process is going to look like. Now, I understand credibility and different types of credentials, which means we're not saying that the status quo or 1%ers or traditional policymakers aren't part of this process, but that we find a way to integrate and bring in those voices that are typically marginalized. Oh, 1 second. So I'm going to end with the post-positivist policy models. I'm not too sure if any of you are familiar with Snyder and Ingram's SCTP, that stands for the Social Construction of Target Populations, and Deborah Stone Causal Stories. Deborah Stone is pretty well known for, these are very revolutionary policy models which try to define what the policy process looks like. And so what Snyder and Ingram is saying is that there are 4 categories when policymakers sit down and decide how to create a policy. And you can either be a deviant, a contender, advantaged, or dependent. And based on where you fall in any of those categories at a given time in society, how you're painted based on your identities, you're going to be receiving whatever policy or policymakers say that group gets. So deviants are usually criminals. Criminals are people who have been written off by society. So you're not deserving of benefits. Deviants usually get burdens. If you think about the dependents, these are usually women and children, people who don't necessarily have as much political power, but they're painted as they're positively socially constructed. So society says they're good, they're functioning, they're contributing to a functioning society. They just don't have as much political power. And then if you're advantaged, that means that you have political power, probably linking to economics and money. And we think you're deserving of good policy. And so think of any type of group that you possibly can. And at any time, if you're in one of these boxes, you're going to be the receiver of that type of policy. And on the other hand, Deborah Stone in Causal Stories says with policymakers, you have lobbyists. Whatever narrative behind a different group makes it onto the agenda, onto that policymaker's mind, is the one that is going to be the selected one. So how good are you? And which one is it going to be? You can put whatever the story is at that time. It's stories that shapes policy. That's what she's arguing. And so as you see the rise of different marginalized groups, such as Palestinians, or even Black Lives Matter, or even LGBTQ rights, it's the stories that start to come up that really play to the emotional triggers of policymakers as well. And it's really attempting to humanize different things that we as academics and politicians and policymakers sometimes forget about in our day-to-day jobs, which is something that Henry Kissinger speaks about in World Order. If we can get away from the need to make snapshot day-to-day decisions and step back and look at the whole, we could make better policy. And I think that's something we need to consider when thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.